So greetings again and hello everyone. So let us welcome you on our third ETN training webinar. So today we will dive into study design in aquatic telemetry, and we will learn about deployment tricks and will be introduced to design hitches as well. My name is Maria Prchalova, and together with Rananel Pigholt, we lead Working Group 4 Training and Knowledge Dissemination of the European Tracking Network Cost Action. I opened the last week webinar by a note that it was an International Day of Smile. Today, I don't have a clue whether there is some international opportunity to celebrate, besides, of course, International Day of Study Design in Aquatic Telemetry. However, I can share one local Czech fact with you. We had a Parliament or Chamber of Deputies election here in the Czech Republic last Friday and Saturday. And for the first time after 30 recent years of existence of Czechia as a free and not totalitarian country, communists did not get sufficient support to get to the parliament. Anyway, let's move on. Today's webinar will be presented by two experts in planning aquatic telemetry studies, Joseph Pratt and Ian Jonsen. Joe is a technical lead at the Ocean Tracking Network, OTN. He oversees the technical operations, and with his team, they deploy and recover acoustic telemetry moorings for OTN and their global partners. He assists in project planning, mooring designs, and other technical operations. Joe also helps OTN partners with field logistic issues, occasionally traveling to consult on site. Joe is also a lifelong passionate ocean and shark lover and a recurring speaker at Dalhousie University's annual Erasmus Brown field course. And now some facts about Ian. Ian is a research fellow at the Department of Biological Sciences of Macquarie University, Australia. He is a quantitative ecologist, primarily focused on developing analysis tools for animal movement ecology. Ian works with OTN, the Australian Integrated Marine Observing System Animal Tracking Facility, and the United States Animal Tracking Network, where he assists with continental scale ocean observing network design and to develop and implement data quality control methods for animal telemetry. The structure of today's webinar will be as follows. We will open with Joe's approximately 30-minute presentation, after which Ian will continue with his 20-minute talk. Following the presentation, Joe and Ian will hold a question and answer session in which they would be happy to take questions and discuss comments from the audience. And that is all from my side. And now we can proceed with presentations. So Joe, please, can you share your screen? I will unshare mine.
Planning a deployment for acoustic receivers can actually be a rabbit hole of problems and issues that need to be addressed. Just talking specifically about the infrastructure, the receivers themselves, the primary questions that come up when any deployment is looming are, how many receivers do we need to deploy to do the job? Which is often a reflection of your budget, whether that be monetary or time. Acoustic receivers can be relatively cheap or they can be very, very expensive. So deploying a large number of them can be very problematic in terms of spending all of your money. The other side of that is that every acoustic receiver deployed represents a certain amount of personnel hours, not just on the deployment, but the fact that they have to be maintained, potentially acoustically offloaded throughout the deployment, and eventually recovered. So ship time is often the most expensive part of any at-sea acoustic deployment. So for a multi-year study, it definitely has a major impact on the budget in terms of what is actually feasible to bring in as capital. When putting acoustic receivers in the water, depth is a major issue. The Z-axis aspect, where it is possible to deploy equipment too deep for a particular tag to be detected. It's possible to be limited by the equipment itself. Most acoustic receivers have a manufacturer specified depth rating. So assuming that you're not exceeding that intentionally, it does limit you to certain areas, certain bodies of water, and certain depths. And the depth is also typically influenced by the target species. So for example, if you're tagging a demersal benthic fish, your receivers are typically going to be deployed lower to the bottom. If you're tagging salmon smolts or some other small surface running animal, you may need to suspend your receivers up from the bottom in order to decrease the gap between the actual tag and the receiver itself. The final question, just in terms of building an array, is how close together on a 2D space do you want to deploy your receivers? And again, this is a function of the tag power or tag powers that are in your system, how many receivers you have, and how much geographical area you are looking to cover in your particular study. So tag power is a big one. It's possible to deploy acoustic receivers in a way that are very conducive to detecting tags of a certain power, but if you introduce tags of a different power, all of a sudden your array is no longer functioning the way that you had designed it, and your data outputs are going to suffer accordingly. So the major assumption going into what I'm talking about today is that you as a telemetrist have done your homework in that you've gathered your range test data, which is a very common and standard practice for assessing how an array should be deployed. You go out and you gather a set of range test data based on tags similar to the power that you're going to introduce in your animals, and actually gather some real world detection limitation data, which will tell you how far away from a receiver can a tag be detected, or how far away from a receiver will a tag start to drop off. And based on that, you can decide, okay, where do we want to deploy, how deep, and how far apart. So the simplest situation for deploying acoustic receivers is just a single station deployment. And what I mean by single station is either just that, just one receiver that you put down somewhere, or receivers put down in a way that each station acts more or less independent from another. So they're single stations, regardless of number, but they're only serving as a single station in a particular area, and they're not close enough to another station to give you the supplementary data that you would get from a line or a grid or a gate. So single stations can be very functional. They can actually produce some different data sets depending on your environment and how you deploy them. Single stations are typically used in choke point areas, so entry points to a river system or at the mouth of a bay, assuming that you can deploy a receiver in a place where hypothetically no tagged animal should be able to pass by it without being detected by that receiver. At OTN, we deal a lot with what we refer to as buoys of opportunity. So this would be infrastructure that already exists outside of OTN deployments. So either a partner is deploying a buoy for a particular reason, or we know that there's a piece of infrastructure in an area, and we just simply request to affix a receiver to it. So this is useful in that it saves the planning, the actual costs that go into building and deploying a mooring. It's just a matter of getting the receiver to that mooring, if affixed in some way, which is usually fairly simple with the smaller receiver models, and you've already got something in the water. So this is completely opportunistic. It's usually outside of any real acoustic telemetry plan. It's more of a let's get gear in the water, and if we collect data, if something happens to be detected on it, then some of those questions can be further developed and built off of that information. and potentially you add infrastructure based on that information. So consecutive stations, consecutive single stations can be useful in assessing things like shortest time to travel from A to B. So if you have single stations deployed far away from each other, the same animal gets detected on receivers A and B. That information is rather coarse, but you still have a good idea of, okay, we know the animal crossed here in July and it was picked up over here in September. So within the 2 months, it had to travel X amount of kilometers in that time. It's not useful really beyond that, but it is still information that can be used to form some additional questions that can dictate where additional infrastructure can be placed. In certain environments, consecutive single stations can be useful for things like mortality assessments. And I'll show that in a diagram, but essentially if you tag X number of fish and your receivers are set up in a way that the animals should be hypothetically detected, if 100% of your fish cross point A and only 70% of them cross point V, then you can infer a certain amount of mortality, assuming you have a very good understanding of life history parameters, the environment in which you deployed, and you've mitigated some of the other factors that can influence detection loss. So single stations are typically presence-absence data sets. You know a particular animal was within range of your receiver on a particular day at a particular time. And that can run from a single animal being detected once and never seen again, single animals being detected multiple times over the course of your duration. So you may be able to build a case for some type of residency, whether it's strictly limited to a certain season or year round, depends on life history again, but single animals being detected around a certain area multiple times is certainly possible. You may see multiple animals be detected, again, either once or multiple times throughout the year, or you may have multiple animals being detected over multiple years. So repeat tags, or however you wish to refer to it, is the idea that migrating animals may prefer to use a certain area during the course of their migration at a certain time of year every year. And if you have equipment in the water that is able to detect that, then you can start to infer some serious residency data in that you know a particular animal is going to return to a particular place at a particular time, and you can build some very solid study design questions around that. So the images I have are just very basic waypoint plots. Typically, if we were going to deploy, we would use navigational charts. You'd want a really good understanding of your bottom depth. Ideally, if you're able to get high resolution bathymetry data, it can be useful for things like bottom type. If you're deploying in boulder fields or on ledges or in an environment where the environment itself may potentially impede receiver tag interactions, you would want to know that. You'd also want to source out things like shipping lanes, marine protected areas, whether or not the area of interest is an active fishing zone. Fisheries interactions is a major source of equipment loss if you put enough equipment in the water. So there are a lot of things that you as a telemetrist need to source before the gear hits the water. So this is just a very basic snapshot of what an equipment deployment waypoint would look like. In this case, it's just the simplest option. You have a single station, which are often either deployed, as said, on a buoy of opportunity. So there was already something in the water here that you as the user just requested or affixed a piece of gear to, or it's an area that we know from observation from previous work happens to be an area of interest for whatever our target species may be. So a common one in my neck of the woods, this could potentially be a seal haul out. and we know that there is anecdotal evidence of white sharks being detected in the area. So deploying a receiver down next to this haul out, in conjunction with some of the active tagging operations that are going on, within Canada and within the United States, it gives you a good probability of detecting a tagged animal. And assuming that you do get detections of tagged animals, you could then build an array that could be used to answer some additional questions. So it's just a starting point to build some serious telemetry questions, and usually observational or tied into some very serious understanding of life history of your target species. This image just kind of shows the single stations at a distance scenario. So if one of our partner receivers down in Florida picks up an animal and we see that same animal X amount of time later during the annual north-south migration, that information is, as I said, it's coarse, but it's still valuable in that we know where the animal was at two distinct points of the year. We know the animal survived the trip, and you can do certain things with that data, but it's typically just a matter of, okay, presence, absence, and then what can we use in addition to that to answer some questions. In this case, we've got single stations serving as choke point gates. So this is a rather shallow system, and as it moves from left to right, you're leaving kind of brackish into full-on seawater. So you would see animals moving out to sea as they move from left to right. And assuming that the environment or the tag power, of the animals that you are tagging allows for hypothetical 100% detection as it swims through those two choke points, you could use this to build mortality assessments, as I spoke to earlier. So 100% of your fish are tagged on the left side of the first station. And as they move through the system, if you don't see 100% detection all the way on the right side station, you can infer some mortality information from that. Again, that's very broad. There are a lot of issues that would need to be addressed, and mortality assessments can be difficult if you are using the PPN system of tags, especially if you have a large density of tags in an area at a certain times. Tag collision probabilities are much higher. So some of that detection loss would likely be due to some other factors than straight mortality. But this is kind of the beginning of how you would build that kind of study design if you were limited to just a handful of receivers in a narrow environment. The last example, and it just kind of outlines the point I made about receiver spacing and tag power. If you look at something like the Halifax line, so this is the major line that we maintain off of Halifax here in Nova Scotia, OTN's largest array. It's some 256 stations spaced 800 meters apart. For a large power tag, hypothetically, again, removing all other mitigating factors, if an animal is moving up during the north-south migration and it passes through that corridor, it's set up in a way that it very close to 100% should be detected. At 800 meter spacing on a big 16 millimeter tag, your detection range is over 1 kilometer. So it should be picking up most of the animals moving through that system. However, if you're carrying low power tags, it is entirely possible to swim between two receivers or to swim above a receiver if it's deployed in 200, 300 meters of water without being detected. So in one scenario, you have a system that is very good at detecting all of the tags, but if you drop the tag power down, all of a sudden you would not expect to see upwards of 100% detectability. So receiver spacing, receiver depth, they definitely do influence what you can expect as a data set depending on the tags that are moving through your system. So another way you can deploy a set of receivers is either in what's, or I refer to as a gate or a line. So this is a pre-planned array of stations deployed at a consistent distance from each other in order to cover a certain geographical spacing. So a gate or a line can be used to close off an area. So like a bay where you have one entry and one exit point. When I speak of a gate or a line, they can be the same, again, depending on your tag power situation. But in my mind, a gate represents your theoretical 100% detection. So a gate should be built in a way where no animal should be able to pass through it without being detected, where a line, you may just have a line of receivers, but the spacing is such that you could still see tagged animals move between them. So gates and lines are good at assessing residency in that you know your animals are moving into your system and you know that they should not be detected until they move out of your system. So you can use that information to assume that your animals remain in your system for X amount of time. You can double up a gate, and I'll show that in a diagram, and it allows you to gain additional movement information. So as it passes from one line in your gate through another line, and you can get some detection probability data from that setup. So again, Halifax can be considered either a line or a gate. If you're carrying a big high-powered tag and your detection probability is up in that 100% range, then I would consider that to be effectively a gate. Obviously, with this much geographical spread and all of the factors that go into deep water offshore deployments, it's very rare that that's actually the case, but it could be thought of as a gate for big high power tags. For most tags though, it's just the line, it's the Halifax line. So low power tags are definitely not going to be detected as they move through any two receivers 100% of the time. So it's a line of receivers deployed strategically. You'll notice the elbows and the bends in the array. Those weren't pre-planned. The line used to be a lot straighter. However, over the years, we came into several different classes of fisheries interactions, and we had to adjust accordingly to avoid different draggers and trawlers that were having, major impact on the deployment. So it goes without saying that you should be expected to have to adjust, especially if you're deploying long term, if your receivers are going to remain in one place for multiple years. So this is another real world OTN array. So this is a closed system. So this is a bay that has no exit as you move through the northeast there. So we've got a couple of different receiver sets here. There's a few scattered single stations up on the northern shore. But the area of interest right now is the double gate. So as you move out the mouth of this bay, we have a double gate of receivers. So these are deployed, I think it's 500 or 600 meters apart from each other. So this array was built specifically for lobster. So it is designed in a way that it should serve as a gate. None of the tags the animals are carrying should be able to pass in or out of the bay without being detected on any line of receivers and any gate, and any of the gate receivers should be picking up the animals as they move in and then as they move out. So this is a double gate system. So as you can see, it's just a parallel gate running just north of the mouth gate. And as you can imagine, if an animal crosses a receiver on the southernmost gate and then is picked up by another receiver on the northern gate, you do get that supplementary information of, where it was moving, the time of arrival differences between the two receivers, and you can use that information to kind of generate some detection probability information. So gates are very useful for this type of system, but again, it does depend on the available infrastructure because you need to be able to span the shore to shore in a way that your animals shouldn't be able to pass through without being detected. You can deploy receivers in a grid, whether a loose grid or a tight, geometrically, pleasing to the eye grid is really up to you. But a grid is just a high volume deployment of receivers. Typically, it's either in a closed system, something like a lake, or you have a really solid understanding of where your animals are going to be at a very specific time. So you can put your receivers down in a highly concentrated way that allows you to maximize detections while your animals are present in that area. So grids are useful for getting high volume detection data, but you really need to make sure that if you're going to pack your receivers in a fairly dense geographic area, they're not just going to leave your system and you're going to lose that information. So typically they're tied into either total coverage of an area if the infrastructure available allows it, or exactly where they are based on fisheries data or based on previous studies, and you effectively deploy over top of where the animals to be. So it does allow for high levels of detections, and based on the detection data, if you have a single animal being detected across multiple receivers, it does give you a sense of where the animal was, at least based on the movement from receiver to receiver. So this is from the GLaDOS group. So this is the Great Lakes Telemetry Group here in Canada. The United States. So this is a total coverage grid. They've effectively deployed receivers in a way that maps out the entire system. Obviously, you need the resources to maintain, to deploy, and to service this array. So it is a lot of work, but obviously the data that would be generated from this would be very valuable. You would not have an animal present in this system that would not produce multiple detections, and you would be able to do quite a bit with that data set. Conversely, this is one of the OTN partner systems deployed off of Sable Island here in Nova Scotia. This is just a 5x5 1 kilometer spacing grid designed specifically to pick up halibut, tagged halibut deployed in conjunction with some fisheries work. We know, based on the data that went into building this project, where the animals are, where they fish for them. So the array was put down exactly where that happens. Once the animals leave this grid, though, there's nothing detecting them. So assuming that you have that understanding and you know exactly where your animals are, a grid is a good way of determining what they're doing while they're in your grid. So are they moving? Are they remaining, next to a single station for the duration? But this is a really tightly packed grid designed for a very specific reason, for a very specific project. Obviously, you could gain opportunistic data if something with a tag did swim through. However, that's not the intent of this array, and it would just be that. It would be opportunistic. Great if it happens, but it's not what it's designed for. You can take a grid one step further and build positioning arrays. So positioning arrays are typically grids as well. However, they're designed in a very particular way, much closer together than a grid typically is, and they're designed to allow for high resolution positioning data. So the idea behind that is that if you have any 3 receivers that detect a single tag transmission, you can use the information from those 3 detections, and you can use the time of arrival differences to each one of the receivers to determine 3D position of the animal. So you can use a series of 3D positions to build animal tracks, effectively giving you movement through your system. So positioning arrays are pre-planned, deployed in a very specific way. The geometry has to be maintained through the use of reference tags. So fixed interval tags that would be deployed in your system to make sure that your receivers remain where they're supposed to be. Receiver spacing is also typically fairly tight. So depending on your tag power, again, they can be, 100 meters apart. They could be much tighter based on life history of your animal and your particular environment. So positioning arrays often look like grids. However, they're closer together, and they're typically a little bit more forethought that has to go into building one. And obviously the data output is exactly that. It's that fine scale, high resolution positioning data or animal tracks as they move through your system. So my last slide here just shows, again, the same system that I mentioned earlier. That grid in the middle is a positioning array. So those receivers are something like 250 to 300 meters apart from each other. There are reference tags built into the system, and the receivers were deployed in a way to maximize detection efficiency, which is usually a conversation with the manufacturer. In this case, it was an Dalhousie array, in order to maximize the data, because positioning arrays often require a middleman, as it were, a data handler. In this case, and Dalhousie had to take the data collected from that positioning system, analyze it, process it, and return it as a viable data product. So consultation with the manufacturer, if that is the route you're taking, is important so that they have complete understanding of the array, the potential data being generated, and are able to produce the highest quality data set. The major issue with positioning arrays is the error associated with those triangles. So the farther your receivers are apart from each other, the more error is introduced in trying to isolate that 3D position. So for example, something like that halibut array I showed earlier, the receivers are 1 kilometer apart. It is hypothetically possible to have a single detection on 3 receivers, but the data that would be associated with the error that would be associated with producing a position data point would likely be too high to be viable. So it really has to be a lot of planning and consultation and forethought that goes into building positioning arrays in order to get the resolution of data that you would expect from it. And I believe that's everything for me. I will now be turning it over to Ian. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for presentation. And Ian, please, can you share your screen and continue? The stage is yours.
Yes. Can everybody see the title slide?
Yes. Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you again for coming. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. So following on from Joe's talk, I'm going to focus on arguing for an approach for using simulation models where possible in acoustic study design. And okay, so really I'm talking about quantitative study design, and this is really an approach to define how a statistical sample or samples should be selected, how the data are collected, how they're analyzed, and how the data analyses can be interpreted. I don't have time to go into all of these details. So what I really want to focus on today really is about an approach for evaluating how data should be collected in an acoustic telemetry study. So obviously, the study design that we would like to employ is going to be largely defined by the research question and the type of analysis that's required to answer that question. So whether we're talking about simply detecting presence, absence of tagged animals, to understanding something about their movement behavior and potential internal or environmental drivers, habitat use or species distribution patterns and their potential drivers, or possibly survival of tagged animals through time and space. So some of the fundamental studies design questions in acoustic telemetry obviously focus on basic things like how many animals should I tag? And clearly there's a range of constraints on how many animals anybody can tag, ranging from ethical considerations of a particular species or a particular population, whether it's ethical to tag as many individuals as you can, or whether some lower number is preferable. And this, of course, will be governed by ethics control boards. But there are other practical considerations, such as expected tag failure rates, the actual spatial scale of the study, the cost of the tags, and of course, deployment logistics. How difficult and time consuming is it to catch individuals and deploy tags on them? And similarly, the other obvious basic question is how many receivers should I deploy? And of course, there are cost and logistical constraints on this as well. So usually a question that all of us have is, how likely am I to detect a tagged animal given I've put out X number of individual tags on animals and I have X number of receivers deployed? So some of the basic questions underlying that are really, what's the optimal receiver array design for my study, given the kinds of questions I have? And Joe's spent a lot of time outlining the number of the different possibilities. So these really are questions, as Joe discussed, of numbers of receivers to deploy, the positioning of those receivers relative to what may be known about study animal movements and their distribution, and array design issues, such as the kind of spatial configuration of the receivers, the spacing between the receivers that need to be employed. But in cases where we may have relatively little prior information about our study animals, it's a real open question to how do we actually answer this fairly basic question. So what I'm going to argue here is a case for using simulation models to complement empirical knowledge. So we can think of empirical knowledge just as prior information that we or the research community may have about a study animal, the particular kinds of research questions we wish to address in a particular study system. And this prior empirical knowledge is obviously fundamental to how we go about designing a study. We may use information from similar species that have been tracked acoustically, or similar acoustic tracking studies conducted in the same area. But sometimes this prior knowledge isn't really enough to help us design a telemetry study. So we can use approaches like simulation modeling and stochastic simulation models to help fill in some of the knowledge gaps that might exist. And this tends to be a really powerful approach if we use it in an iterative fashion. So we might think about starting with aggregating our empirical knowledge, so what's known about our study animal, maybe formalizing some of that in a simple simulation model, use the model to generate some predictions, and then go out and conduct perhaps a pilot study to see, to assess the feasibility of tracking the animal. And we can use some of that information from pilot studies to actually update our simulation and get to the point where we may have a solid design that will work for a full-blown research project. So using individual-based simulation models, we can use this to evaluate alternative acoustic telemetry designs that account for things like variability and tag performance, and receiver array design. So again, the numbers of receivers and their spatial configuration, and what kind of approach we might need to actually detect our study species. So what I want to first outline is sort of a very general, simple, straightforward simulation approach that can be used with the GLaToS R package. Now, Joe has mentioned the GLaToS network. They're focused on the Great Lakes in North America. And their group has put together a nice R package that has a variety of tools for analyzing acoustic telemetry data, and also some simulation tools that help with study design. So I'm just going to sort of run through some of the basics of the simulation tools available in this package. At the end of the talk, I'll pull up a slide that provides a link to a number of packages for analysis of acoustic telemetry data, including the GLaToS package. So what you can do in GLaToS is you can simulate simple animal movements as a kind of correlated random walk, and you have some flexibility on the kind of tortuosity of the movements and the spatial scale of the movements. And you can constrain these simulated tracks to stay within a polygon, such as a lake or an ocean basin. And so this image here is actually Lake Erie. Outline is Lake Erie. And this is in the Krauss et al. Methods in Ecology and Evolution paper, where they've just simulated some animal tracks that traverse the lake over time. And you can couple those simulated tracks with a receiver array design, and they have some tools available for defining a receiver array. So Joe showed a real world example of a GLaToS array covering a small area. This is a hypothetical array covering in grid fashion the entirety of Lake Erie. And you have this possibility to play around with different receiver spacing distances. And then on top of that, you can control how you simulate tag detections. So a typical simulation function would be a logistic decay function. So the probability of detecting a tag obviously declines as the distance between the tag and the nearest receiver increases. And you can define that relationship as a logistic model. And you can use that in the simulation to game out detections of these simulated animal tracks given your receiver grid. And you can use this kind of approach. So here I've just diagrammed an example on the left where we can simulate receivers arrayed either in three lines. So these are the red vertical lines traversing Lake Erie versus the grid array. So think of the blue dots arranged in the grid there. And we can simulate animals moving throughout the lake and look at their detection rates as a function of the two different receiver array designs. So that's what this plot on the right is showing. And you can summarize the results of your simulation models a variety of different ways. The Krauss et al. Paper I provided the reference to in the previous slide uses a number of different metrics, but a really basic one is just what's the probability of detecting a tag given the two different receiver arrays. And you can see here that not surprisingly in this case, the gridded receiver array has a much higher probability of detecting tags just once or detecting any tag multiple times than the lines do. And that's simply a function of the receivers covering a much greater portion of the lake. But you can imagine scenarios where it's not nearly as straightforward a priori to realize which approach might be best. And this is how we can use simulation models to help look at that without going to the trouble of actually deploying in the real world. So a lot of times, more realistic simulations might be necessary. So we can think about using individual-based simulation models that use them to infer what the optimal acoustic telemetry design might be, and taking into account not only that variability in tag performance or different kinds of tags with different transmitting powers, and the different receiver array designs, but we can also think about potentially diverse animal movement behavior. So, well, what if animals don't follow something that looks like a very simple correlated random walk? We can build in more sophisticated movement patterns, behaviors into the model. And we can also look at potential environmental drivers of the movement. So in sort of more open ocean contexts, we can look at the influence of ocean currents, the effects of temperature as a constraint on movement as well. And we've done some of this modeling with the Ocean Tracking Network in the context of looking at Atlantic salmon migration. And this is, this animation here is a simulation model I've put together looking at deployments of Atlantic salmon on a number of different rivers in Atlantic Canada and simulating their movements as a bias correlated random walk. So they're moving towards a particular goal. In this case, they're migrating northward along the continental shelf up to northern Labrador. And their movements are constrained to a certain degree by ocean currents and by temperature. And their migration is actually, doesn't start until the ocean temperature reaches at least 7 degrees Celsius, which is pretty darn cold. But we can use this kind of simulation. I guess I should also mention the gray dots here represent existing receiver arrays on the continental shelf off of Newfoundland and Labrador. And we can use these simulation models to predict things like potential timing of arrival of tagged salmon smolts to the vicinity of these receivers. And we can, I haven't diagrammed it here in the animation, but we can also use the simulation to look at detection rates on those receivers. And this is what we've done this past year. Now we can also use these simulations. This is an example here where we're looking at Atlantic salmon kelts. So these are adults that have spawned at least once. And some researchers have been tagging kelts on the Campbellton River, this red triangle in northern Newfoundland. And some of these individuals will be repeat spawners, which means that they will spawn in the river and then they will migrate back to sea for a period of maybe 50 to 70 days, forage, basically building up energy reserves, and then migrate back to the river again to spawn once more before overwintering in the river. And one of the things we were interested in looking at is sort of generally where do these kelts go when they go to sea, and when do they arrive there? So we know that the kelts migrate to this area of the Grand Banks in general, but we don't know so much about how quickly they get there. And so we can use our simulation model to game out their migration into the ocean and predict their timing of arrival to this foraging area on the Grand Banks. And we can use that information to help inform wave gliders that the Ocean Tracking Network sent out to patrol to try to detect these kelts. And this summer, we used this simulation approach, and we actually did detect a few animals from those wave gliders. And we can, of course, also look at detection rates on those existing fixed receiver arrays as well. So in addition to sort of that fundamental question of receiver, what's the optimal receiver array design? The other important question, obviously, is what are the factors that are likely to affect detection rates? And these could be environmental effects such as environmental noise, wind or wave action, the particular kind of substrate around receivers, and the positioning of thermocline and how that may change through time. And of course, you can think of other kinds of seasonal or diurnal patterns that might affect detection rates. And so here, what I'd like to just run over is, I think, something that most of us are quite familiar with. So this is just some data from Houvenier's et al. Methods in Ecology and Evolution paper looking at detection probability as a function of distance from receiver. And we know that that detection rate declines as the distance increases, but it's important to actually monitor this and estimate for a particular habitat how those detection rates actually do decline with distance, which can be a function of, as I said, a variety of factors. But in addition to this, detection rate as a function of distance, it's also important to think about how detection rates may vary through time. So this is some data from the GLaTOS group that's in one of their workshop handouts. So it's just a convenient picture to look at, but these are detections through time on 4 different receivers. So the receivers are fixed in place, but you can see, so the red line is a moving average. Those detection rates are fluctuating wildly from basically 0 detections up to 100% detection through time. And you can think of this as the influence of environmental effects through time on detection rates. So actually monitoring how detection probabilities vary in space and time is fundamentally important to any research study design. And these detection rates are really context dependent. So they depend on the spatial location of your receivers and tags. They depend on the kind of habitats they're in and how much environmental variability they're likely to experience. So what I want to argue here is that actually monitoring detection rates with stationary reference tags is really highly recommended approach to gauge how effective your study design really is in detecting animals while you're carrying that study out. And just to go back to the idea of sort of the feedback loop is, I think, using simulations of the kind that I've outlined here are a useful tool for helping fill in some of the knowledge gaps that we might have before conducting a study. And although I haven't really outlined it in any detail, the idea of conducting pilot studies before doing your full-blown research study can often be invaluable if time and money allow. And there's a really important component of doing that, and that's conducting this detection monitoring, which we can use to help inform subsequent simulations, perhaps to look at full-on research project level deployments of tags. And while you're conducting your research project, collecting monitoring detection probabilities during the project are also invaluable to get a good handle on how detection rates may be varying through the course of the project. I'm sorry, I just hit that button. And then, as I promised, that's really the take-home message I wanted to convey. And as I promised, I would just flash up a slide of links to various analysis packages that are available. The bottom there is the GLaTOS package. And hopefully I've gone through that not too quickly, but fast enough so there's time for questions. So thank you very much.
I really thank both of you for truly professional talks on study designs. We have no questions within the chat. Okay, David?
Sorry, I clapped instead of raised a hand, but anyway, so good.
That's okay, I saw you.
Ian, I had a question for you. So I think one of the things you mentioned is monitoring through the period your study is active, maybe having sentinel tags in place to monitor your efficiency. I was just wondering, what is your advice on once you've collected the efficiency data and you've fitted maybe some logistical regression curves, etc. How do you adjust your true data for using that data, and what is the best approach? Because that's the sort of I find it relatively easy to the first step, but then the second step is a little bit harder for me.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question, and the short answer is, unfortunately, there's no sort of straightforward approach for doing that in most cases. I guess the sort of the most straightforward case I can think of is if the goal of the telemetry project is to estimate survival, perhaps in like a classical way where you'd use something like a Cormack jelly Sieber model, which is, you know, a well-known model for estimating survival through time when you have repeated detections of animals. You can gain some information on detection rates by using the model itself, but the sort of fundamental drawback of that approach is the last point at which you detect an animal, you can't estimate the detection probability. So if you know the location where you're detecting animals, the last point. So if you think of animals maybe that migrate to sea, then your last receiver line, if you're monitoring detection rates there, you can actually inform the model by fixing detection rates based on the data that you've collected. So that's one way that you can directly use those detections data. Now, obviously, not all of us are interested in estimating survival or have a system where we can do that easily. But I think it's even in a more qualitative way, just being able to understand how detection rates may be fluctuating over the course of your research project is a really useful thing to have. So in the absence of that, it's most common you assume detection rates are constant over the course of your study. But if you're collecting the sentinel tag data, almost all of us will see that it's just not so. So, I mean, you can use that information to potentially point to times during your study period where detection rates may be quite low versus other times where they're high, and you may be able to use that, as I said, in a qualitative sense to inform inferences about detections of your animals. But yes, it's not a really simple approach. It really depends on what's the question and what's the analysis you're using. Sometimes you can build that information in as a prior, for example, into your analysis, and sometimes it does have to be a more qualitative approach.
So if David is satisfied, we can go with Diana. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. So I was just wondering, Ian, if the GLaDOS models are able to account for changes in detection probability with depth, so say depth of the tag, or if you can incorporate something like bathymetry, because the way you explained it, it seemed as though you're including that decrease in efficiency with distance on a horizontal plane, but I'm wondering if it also can go vertically.
Yeah, no, excellent question. Yes, for simplicity, what I was showing you was in the horizontal plane, but I mean, in the simulation models, sort of the more realistic ones that I showed, that's code that I've written that kind of uses GLaDOS as a backbone and then adds details to it. The distances calculated between tag and receiver are in 3D. So you're taking into account the actual depth of the tag. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty straightforward to do with the tools available.
Okay. And it would be possible to use, like, to include bathymetry as a factor, do you think?
Yeah, you could do that. I mean, if these are completely hypothetical receiver deployments, then if you have bathymetry data, and you have some way of assessing how that depth is going to vary given your receiver placement, then yeah, you can incorporate that in. I mean, it's just simply using Pythagoras's rule to calculate distance. So it's no longer just in the horizontal. You take the vertical into account as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So mostly when we're talking about receiver deployment for, let's say, 3D localization, we're talking about empirical empirical knowledge or empirical data, or maybe having a pilot. But what about some quantitative design, let's say, taking into account acoustic propagation, bathymetry, and bathythermic? So I'm in a group that is designing this type of tools. So I'm asking, what is your idea about it?
In terms of how you might go about doing that in a simulation model?
For example, in a simulation model, or using modeling of the acoustic propagation to determine the positions of the receivers to have a proper 3D localization.
Yeah. I think it's possible to incorporate some aspects of that. The way I would personally go about doing something like that is, I mean, if there was some pilot data that looked at detection rates on an existing array that you could link to environmental data. So whether it's something like thermocline depth or something related to that, then you can statistically estimate that relationship. So how do detection rates change as a function not only of distance, but also of thermocline depth or some other aspect of the thermocline or pycnocline, whatever may be affecting acoustic propagation most. So you can estimate that relationship, and then you can build that statistical relationship into your simulation. So the idea would be that you're just capturing kind of the essence of what may be going on, and you can allow that to change stochastically through the simulation. There are more complicated ways where you actually build a theoretical model of sound propagation into your simulations.
Yeah, there's software to build this model, to have this calculation.
Yep. So that's the other approach. It would tend to complicate the model, but it ultimately depends on what your goal is. If it's really to look at sound propagation and how that affects detections, then you probably would want to go that route and build that theoretical model in.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have a question for Joe. Hi, Benny.
Yep.
So you mentioned the way to design arrays, right, for the high resolution positioning data for calculating animal tracks. And I was wondering, when you deal with arrays on such large arrays, how do you cope, right? So when you offload each of the receivers, right, you have to usually sync them, right? Synchronize the times and then return them. How do you deal with such large arrays in terms of offloading data and keeping them somewhat synchronized? Like, every time you offload, you necessarily have to offload your entire array, or do you plan them accordingly?
Yeah, so there's only a few, there's probably a handful of positioning arrays that we directly maintain, and they're typically on a 100% offload timeline. So once a year, the entire array is pulled, all of the data is offloaded. I think one of the core issues you're referring to may be the idea of drift, which it was definitely a major issue that comes up in any deployment, not just positioning arrays, but the idea that your clocks are typically based on an internal clock in the receiver and the clock of whatever computer you're using to configure that receiver. Most of the receivers I've dealt with, it's well built into the software. It will either prompt you a few times, are you sure your clock is correct? Because it takes the receiver time from your computer on configuration. So things like time zones, local versus UTC, they're factors that have to be considered, but the software goes a long way to ensuring that the clock in the receiver is as accurate to real time as possible. And then on the back end, because the receivers do have a tendency to drift. So after you pull it a year or 14 months later, the receiver clock will not typically match the clock that you're seeing in internet time in the case of our field laptops. So that clock drift is addressed in post-processing. So the OTN data team is very good at adjusting detections to match what the actual time is and not what the receiver time is. But it is something that does have to be addressed, because if the clock drift is significant, the data becomes invalid. So we have had cases where something has gone functionally wrong in a receiver and the clock has been way off on the scale of hours or days, and it's just not recoverable. You cannot trace a detection to when it actually happened in the real world sense. So that that detection data has to be discarded. So is definitely something that has to be maintained and addressed. In our case, we've got an entire data team that typically handles that kind of thing. And the additional benefit to enlisting the manufacturer in the case of a positioning data set is that all of that will be included in the processing. But even just as a telemetry user, the clocks, they're important to manage, and the software prompts that you see, ensuring that the receiver clock is as close to real time on deployment and adjusting any drift on the back end are kind of paramount in ensuring that your data set is as clean as possible in matching detections to when they actually happen in real world.
Joe, don't take this personally, but Ronald has kind of unstable connection.
Yeah, no, I get it.
So he will be back in a minute, but we can move on. And he wrote to me that he heard most of your answer.
Okay.
Yeah, and I should say sorry on his behalf.
No, that's not a problem.
He'll be back. So any other question? Guys, don't be shy. We have two experts here. Okay, Jena.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit related to the last question, but maybe for Joe, I'm just wondering how you would approach analyzing data that's when the downloading of receivers is spaced out over a very long period of time. So I'm kind of dealing with that at the moment. We're trying to download our data, but there's a lot of logistics and ship time and all this. So some receivers will have been downloaded in September and others like not till maybe mid-November. So would you deal with that by cutting off all of the data to match the shortest one when you do the analyses, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we do that a lot. The major OTN lines are typically staggered. At least up until the glider program took off, we would only be able to offload chunks at a time. And depending on the time of year, it could be weeks or longer between stations being offloaded. I think it comes down to the questions and the temporal scale you're looking at. So if it's a case of, if all of your data is collected in the span of a year and they're just interested in detection information, then maybe there's no problem in just having a consolidated data set that spans 12 months. But if you need a narrow time period, or if you're trying to answer some very specific temporal questions, you may need to parse it and look at it as a specific data set. You know, depending on, especially if you're seeing changes, whether they be behavioral or life history related in those temporal areas based on your target animal. If they're doing something different in one data set, but something different in another, you may be hesitant to overlap the two just because your questions have changed. You're trying to infer data from one set of behaviors as opposed to another. So there's no real problem in consolidating, but you just have to have a handle on what it is you're trying to answer based on that data set.
Yeah. Thanks.
That
makes sense.
That makes sense.
Well, guys, I think that we asked all the questions the audience already had. So thank you very much again, Ian and Joe, to spend your time with us today. And we will get in touch later. And we thank all of you who connect today during this webinar. And I guess that we will meet with many of you tomorrow during the next ETN training webinar on data management, visualization and analysis. Tomorrow we will be talking about another R package, which is constructed or developed directly for ETN purposes. Okay, guys. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you enjoy it, and you can review it once it's uploaded to the ETN YouTube channel.